Welcome, everybody. My name is Tony Troop. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Communications and Development at Jane Doe Inc., also known as JDI. I'm really delighted to welcome you to this segment of Five Things with Jane Doe. For those of you who are expecting to see JDI's Communication and Outreach Coordinator, Tara Agaba, I'm here as the guest host today and again on December 9th, but don't worry, she'll be back in January. So thanks in advance for your patience as I attempt to manage all of this technology as smoothly as she does. We are just delighted that today our guest is here from the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, Tre'Andre Valentine. Welcome. It's been great. But before we get into it, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jane Doe for those of you who are new. We are a coalition of 59 domestic and sexual violence programs spread throughout Massachusetts, from the Cape to the Berkshires and everywhere in between. And along with our members and a host of other partners in the public and private sectors, we work to amplify the voices of all those who are impacted by gender-based violence and in all the many ways that their lives are impacted. And we also work to undo the social injustices that perpetuate an abuse of power to begin with on both a local, community, systemic, and social level. I welcome you as a survivor of sexual assault and harassment myself and as an advocate for social justice. We want to make sure that folks know that if you are or have or find yourself experiencing sexual assault or domestic at any time, that the space is for you above all. And if you need to speak to somebody about resources, about your options, about, just to talk to somebody about what you're experiencing, local programs provide free and confidential services. And they have most of them. If they don't have a hotline, there are hotline numbers available that you can call somebody 24/7. You can go to janedoe.org, find help right now, and we'll also share more links and resources at the end of the segment. Over the past 6 months, Tara has created a community of friends and supporters through our Facebook Live Five Things. And we built this as a way really to reflect the diversity of survivors and the many folks and organizations who are working to end gender-based violence and our related issues around racial justice and dignity for everyone. We're delighted to uplift their stories here as part of our broader struggle. And whether you have joined us for past episodes or you're here for the first time, thank you for joining the conversation. Please share this with your networks, help spread the word and the resources. And we hope that all of you watching today will, of course, come back for future Five Things. They typically take place on Wednesdays at 11 a.m. on Facebook Live, but check our social media just in case something has changed. Well, we're wrapping up Transgender Awareness Month, and we wanted to use this platform to talk about the intersections with gender-based violence and our shared work to promote safety, justice, and dignity for everyone. In recent years, public understanding and conversation regarding the transgender community has moved forward in many ways, right? And yet, as we'll discuss, there is still a lot of work to do. We might have celebrities and more governments, who are, whether it's local cities and towns or states or even countries that are recognizing trans rights. But at the same time, the all too frequent murder of trans people, especially trans women of color, requires a public reckoning on the ways that society still does not see or value the humanity of transgender, non-binary, and gender expressive and expansive people, I should say, here in Massachusetts and around the world. So we're going to talk about some of those disparities, but we're also going to talk about the hope. And we're delighted to have one of the leading organizations here in Massachusetts who is doing this work to both end discrimination and violence and uplift the radical love that is embodied by the transgender community. So it is my pleasure to welcome you, my friend, Tre'Andre Valentine, the Executive Director of MTPC. And to get us started, why don't you say a few words about yourself?
Hi, everyone. And I just want to say thank you to JDI for inviting me to be a part of this segment and to be having conversations with you, Tony, that, we've known each other for quite some time. I think about 10, it's been about 10 years now.
We don't have to do the math, but yes, a while.
But just a little bit about me. I am a queer, trans, Carib Indian, South Asian, and Black immigrant from the beautiful islands of Trinidad and Tobago. I have been doing anti-violence work for about a little over a decade. And I came to MTPC actually in the beginning of when I started transitioning. I found a community within MTPC, became really close with the executive director who was there at the time, Gunnar Scott, and then the executive director after that, Mason Dunn. And now with both have encouraged me to actually take more of a leadership role within MTPC. And so I honestly probably would not be in this position without them today. So thank you very much to both Gunnar and Mason.
Wow, I forgot that you were on the you on the board at some
Yeah, I was
point?
on the steering committee,
Steering committee, that's right.
did a lot of fundraising and events on behalf of MTPC for quite some time.
That is great. Well, it's quite a legacy that they have left, and broad shoulders to stand on. But I know that they are uplifting you, even though they are not both even here in Massachusetts anymore, but continue to do great work. And we're just delighted to see your leadership because be recognized. You are somebody that we often turn to when you were at the Network Lorette to help us think about how do we address the challenges that we're facing and that we're hearing from community and from survivors. So your training background, your education, your organizing, always strong voice. So congratulations. Is it for I know it feels like it's not new anymore, but maybe
It
still
still
a
feels
little
new to me.
it's
And just
great.
quickly, Mason is still in Massachusetts. He's in,
Right. They
yeah,
aren't, but right, they're here, but Gunner's on the other side of the country.
yes, he's in
Right.
Seattle.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to jump in because, part of their history, right, and that was here before you came on board at MTPC was there was a lot of history that got us to where we are, as with everything. And yet, for a lot of people, Yes on Three was kind of one of those bigger public moments, and not always for the right reasons. You and I were talking earlier about how frustrated we were as gender-based violence advocates that the Yes on Three ballot initiative, the opposition was really co opting our messaging around safety and preying on people's myths and misconceptions and hatred and fear of trans people to try to oppose that ballot initiative. So we were proud to be part of that coalition, to say no to that kind of hatred and to say yes to, as it says here, trans liberation for everyone. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what that meant as a moment in time, but also where are we going?
Yeah. So, I mean, this work has been going on for so long. I know that, the Yes on Three campaign, a lot of folks were involved. It probably was one of the first, for some people, some of the first conversations they were having around trans folks and around access and inclusion. But really, the work started back in 2007 when Gunnar was the executive director, and the work to really bring uh, the state laws to include gender identity and gender expression. And that was a fight for about 4 years because we didn't actually have trans rights in Massachusetts until 2011. So there was a lot of opposition and a lot of back and forth for a really long time just to get gender identity and gender expression as a part of our non-discrimination laws. Then, and the reason, I think one of the reasons that we actually were able to get it passed was because public accommodations was not a part of that bill. We actually had to take it out in order to get just, equal rights passed for trans folks. So then when it was signed into law in 2012, um, the fight began for public accommodations in 2013. And it was passed finally in 2016, but there was enough opposition for it to be back on the ballot. And we knew that if there was, if it wasn't really secured into law, that we would never have it. And so this
Mhm.
became sort of like the fight for public accommodations, right? Um, And it involved so many people, so many supporters, so many of our community, so many of our allies. And it, I think the misconception was that it was about bathrooms, and people started calling it the bathroom bill,
Mm-hmm.
but didn't realize that public accommodations was more than that, right? Public accommodations really mean anything that's outside of your home, outside of your work, and outside of your school. So it was about retail stores, it was about restaurants, hotels, healthcare offices, public parks, theaters.
Public parks.
Yeah, public transportation. So many people were being harassed in public transportation, right? So this was really to
Mhm.
solidify that there was no room for discrimination anywhere within Massachusetts.
Right. You know, I'm remembering that now that it was just so insulting that we had to take out such a big, it was like it gutted the bill. I mean, it wasn't that it wasn't significant, the first bill that was passed, it was, it kind of reminds like first we had civil partnerships, or what were they
Mhm,
called? Domestic partnerships, right?
mhm,
Then we had civil unions. Then we
mhm.
had, it's like, wow, that phrase about it rights, like it's not pie, it's like
Yeah,
you don't have to just have a piece of it. It doesn't take any, you don't get less pie if somebody else, has their rights. However, I'm not very good at these analogy things, but you know what I mean, right?
yes.
And it's like, wow, when you tell me that, remind me of that history, it's like, wow, um that indignity of having to say, okay, we will compromise yet
Mhm,
again, and then have to
mhm.
come back another day for another fight.
Yes, exactly. And that was a battle, right? It really was. It's like, do we just say no and fight for it all? Or do we do this piece by piece? And that was strategy, really, sort of like had to be strategic about things. And it wasn't an ideal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of our community members may have felt like we weren't really, doing the work or fighting for equality and accessibility for all. And that was something that we really had to consider and had to work with and had to strategize around. So a lot of this came down to strategy.
Strategy. I think the other thing that really I was so taken by in terms of the positive ways that the Yes on Three folks, organized, and that I see the work that you're doing, on so many different levels here, is that yes, we have to acknowledge and kind of in some ways counter those negative arguments,
Mhm.
but we also want to focus on what we want, and
Exactly.
be like that there were the values that we were upholding, and asking people, it's like, but where are your values? Like, if you start with your values, then you'll make decisions around public accommodations. The fact that we have to even legislate this is itself, mind boggling,
Exactly.
right?
Right.
Because it's like if the values were there, the culture shift, So do you
Yeah.
feel like have you seen some like residuals in a positive way out of Yes on Three, that there is more openness because some of those conversations around values were had, or
I
not?
think that I think that it's interesting. Interesting. It's like a yes and no at
Mm,
the same time. Yes, there's been more conversation. There's been a little bit more movement. There's been a bit of more engagement and involvement, and at the same time, just because we have these strong laws in Massachusetts, it doesn't change people's everyday lived experience,
mm,
right? People are still experiencing homelessness at a really high rate. And this was, again, you and I talked that this was before the pandemic. People are still unemployed and underemployed and having to resort to survival economy. People are still trying to figure out when they're going to get their next meal. There's still a lot of public harassment, right? And still a fear of also, I mean, even getting any sort of um, reaching out for help from, law enforcement who are supposed to uphold the law, but they're actually are part of the problem.
mm-hmm,
And so, yes, we have strong laws, but now the work begins to actually, how do this really trickled down into people's everyday lived experience. How do we now uphold and keep the state and keep people accountable to non-discrimination laws in
Mhm.
Massachusetts?
Yeah, there's the accountability, there's non-discrimination, there's accessibility. I mean, I don't know if this
Exactly.
is a fair analogy, but I feel like we've been talking so much over the past 2 years about voting access. It's
Hmm.
like the voting law was passed how many decades ago now? But
Right.
it's been about access, and it's the same thing. And you have to create the access, you have to create the systems, you have to have a way to hold people accountable, and you need to organize, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is a great segue to your number two. Okay, let me. Oh, I snuck ahead. There we go. So tell us about this cool thing that you did and
Yeah.
what was involved and what have you learned from this community needs assessment?
Absolutely. So, now that MTPC we had done the work, and not only MTPC, but a lot of folks had done the work to secure public accommodations, we were like, okay, well, what do we do now? And we thought, let's sort of like go back to the beginning, which is about community. And I, as the new executive director, I have no claim to knowing exactly what the community needs, or nor should I be leading that myself. And so we developed a community needs assessment to really figure out and understand really what the community is needing and how do they envision MTPC trying to or helping to address those needs. And we've had like previous needs assessments before, but none on this scale. We had about 340 people participate in this, including folks who were currently incarcerated, which is often a group of folks that people don't really think about, right? Folks who are incarcerated. And really, I mean, some things were surprising and some things weren't. For instance, and I'm just going to go through really
Yeah.
quickly some of the things that we discovered. So, and I'll just talk about the top three things within each category. So we looked at basic needs, and the top three needs were employment, homelessness and housing instability, and paying bills and emergency funds, right? Access to that. Then next, we looked at safety, and then number one was public harassment. The second after that was suicide, and the third one was sexual violence. In terms of healthcare, the top three things were insurance coverage, having a knowledgeable provider, and access to gender affirming care. Then when we looked at access to other services, it was mental health and support services, as well as public accommodations, having access to public accommodations. And then we looked at legal help. And the top three things there was help with name and gender marker changes on ID documents, just general access to legal help and resources. And the third one was police interaction. So that really helped us to formulate the direction that we were going to go in next. Like we knew we were going to go back into doing actual community work and developing trans leadership, trans power, and community connection. This helped us to sort of define how we were going to do so. And now that we have gone through our strategic planning process, one of the things that I'm really proud to talk about and share, and I think this is the first time really publicly sharing this, is that we're going to be developing a community leadership program, and where it would help folks, because there is, I see a real lack of investment
Mm.
in our communities, in trans communities, non-binary communities, gender expansive communities, folks of color, Black, brown, indigenous folks. And so we really wanted to have community ownership over what the organization does. And this leadership program is going to be steered and developed by community. And we are going to have, it's going to act like a fellowship so that while
Oh,
people are developing skills, honing skills, learning new things, trying to propel themselves into the next phase of leadership, wherever that may be, that there's going to be financial support while they're going through this program.
oh my God, I love this.
Yes.
I love that it's so community driven. It really harkens to the nothing with it for us without us kind of mentality instead of experts coming in from the outside, recognizing who the experts are, the people who are closest to the experience, the people themselves, right?
Yeah.
With support from folks like you who are of the community, but also then connect, broadly, with others. It's so, what a great foundation. I love it.
Yes, I'm really, really excited about this because we really want to have a intersectional and multi-generational approach to trans leadership, right? That leadership is not just about um, the people who are going to come after us,
Okay.
right? It's really about, I mean, it's leadership can happen in any way, in any phase of life.
Mm. I love that. You shared some of these stats with me yesterday, and I was just blown away. One that I wrote down here was that in the trans community, currently it's documented that it's about 3 times the level of unemployment than the general population, and
Yeah.
as many as 5 times as high for people of color who are, trans women, trans feminine. And then you add on to that, if you're in a rural community where there's already a high level of unemployment,
Mm-hmm.
or you add on other factors like disability, that it just becomes even more compounded. The level of really disenfranchisement, from that whole economy and then everything that comes with that
Yeah.
is so important to to pursue. And I love that you don't have like it's not like we're going to come here to get this sort of training or like a certificate for an entrepreneurship or a certificate for education, but it's more individual. It sounds like you're thinking of something that's more individually based that gives you the skills to then go pursue maybe running for office.
Yes, running for office. If you want to then own your own business, if you want to learn more about organizing, I think it's really about, again, community driven. So, what is the community wanting and needing to actually help them sort of build themselves up, right? Because I think that's actually how I also see myself and
Mm.
also MTPC. It's not it's about how do we build community and build leadership and help be a more of I feel like I'm more of like a mentor, a cheerleader, like
Yeah.
sometimes really, and I've experienced this in my life. Sometimes it's been about when other people have expressed belief in me that I have believed in myself, because I haven't always believed in myself. And sometimes I've needed that to hear that from other people, like you can do this. You have the talent, the potential, right? And
Mhm.
also it's now helping to build the confidence.
Yes, you need all of those pieces in there. It's true. Um, and when you're, um, for whatever reason, it might be the way, an individual experience of growing up in a household where, they were not seen or not believed, but then that gets reinforced through school and through job applications, and just any
Absolutely.
public, that you can see how that confidence gets, really worn away.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's
Yeah, because
important to be.
that we receive messages about ourselves and other people from the time that we are very, very young.
Mhm.
And those messages can really be internalized, right? And for a lot of trans people, I'm not saying that every trans person or every non-binary person has experienced this.
Right.
For a lot of people, it's negative messages, right? And then you
Mhm.
start to believe that about yourself. And so that really can impact how a person navigates through the world and see themselves and see other people. It's by these messages that we receive.
Absolutely. Well, I'm just so excited to see where hear about this project. I'm really excited to see where it goes. I know you don't have a lot of details yet. As I'm sure people will be, wanting to hear, what's the plan? How do you get involved? If you're looking for the trainers and the mentors as well as the people to participate. So, we're looking forward to hearing more from you in coming months, and anything we can do from Jane Doe to help get the word out or support you in this, please let us know. It's very exciting.
Appreciate that. Yes, stay
Really,
tuned.
really awesome. All right, now I got to figure out how to get to the screen here. All right, here we go. Still doing pretty good till now. All right, here we go. Number 4. This, is really interesting because you touched upon some of these earlier, but there's the work you're doing in the community and with the community, and then there's the work and that's really important role that MTPC plays in terms of public education and advocacy, whether it's about systems or policy. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about, you mentioned, I think, the Gender Marker X bill and some other things, but maybe to give us like a picture, like what's your role in this, and
Yeah.
and then we can get into the specifics.
Absolutely. So, I mean, while we are scaling back on some of the policy and legislative work, because that's really taken up the capacity of the organization, that it's not that we're going to stop doing this work, right?
Okay.
That will always still be a part of the work that we'll be doing. And so one of the things is really helping to build a capacity for inclusion within different entities, so organizations and local and state government, right? That we'll still be doing this work. And one of the things that we're going to be that's on our radar. There's several things on our radar, right? We've got the Equality Act, which is on a federal level. That's going to, it's really just a what do you call that? An amendment to the Civil Rights Act to include
Mm-hmm.
gender identity and sexual orientation. MTPC has been a part of helping to advocate for the Roe Act, which there's been some success in that right now here in Massachusetts, right? As well as one of the top things for us is the Gender Marker Expo. And the reason that was one of the top things, if you look at the community needs assessment, that was, in terms of legal help, that was the top thing, was name and gender marker changes on IDs. And right now, the RMV last year actually updated their software to include a non-binary gender marker. So you can get that currently on your driver's license and non-driver state ID, but that does not expand to school IDs or
Mm.
birth certificates or any other form of ID at this point. And so the Gender Marker X bill is actually going to change that. And it was I think it started before I came on as executive director. And there's been some, back and forth, some
Mm-hmm.
changing of language. And it's currently stalled because a lot of things have been stalled due to the pandemic, but it'll be back in the new legislative session come 2021. But one of the things to note too is that currently people cannot, the as the law stands in Massachusetts, people cannot change their name without changing their gender marker.
That
And
doesn't seem.
there's, I know it's confusing and it's very restricting because there are some people who are like, I don't want to change my name. I just want to change my gender marker. And this bill would alleviate that, where people would be able to do both of these things independent of each other. And right now, with being able to get a non-binary marker on a license or non-driver state ID, but not on other documents, people are walking around with mismatched documents, and that is quite problematic for a lot of folks. So this bill will change that, and so the work begins and the work
Right.
continues.
Right. It's so interesting. Like, on the one hand, yes, we all appreciate how COVID-19 has disrupted so many things. And it took a couple of months just for people to figure out, like, how do you meet and where do you talk and where do you share information? I mean, not everybody was already set up to go remote, right? So we have to give people a little pass on kind of needing some time to figure that out. But at the same time, it's not like the world stopped. And people are even, I would guess that during COVID, that members of the trans community just experienced it even in a more, amplified way, like what you're talking about. Like if people needed healthcare or they needed
Yeah.
access or they lost their jobs when they were already, underemployed. And, so I get it. And yet I'm so impatient that,
Yes.
that the legislature, when there's 200 of them, they can't, it's like we've got, we're up in the federal government, like
Yeah.
the politics. I get it. I'm a political junkie. I understand, and I get that there's strategy. And at the same time, it's like, okay, we can't, we got to figure out how to just keep telling our stories and getting out there and seeing the movement we need now because people's lives are impacted right now.
Absolutely. And people's I think one of the things that we've seen is an increase, and you've seen this, an increase in partner violence and
Mm-hmm.
partner abuse, and an increase in suicidality, right? This really has had an impact on people's mental health and their
Mm-hmm.
safety.
And their safety. Absolutely. Yeah, we're hearing definitely, increase in domestic violence, child
Yeah,
abuse, sexual assault.
yeah,
What we're hearing from a lot of advocates that um, it's not necessarily it's a both and it's both
mhm,
that there it's happening in places where they hadn't seen it in relationships they hadn't heard about it though it didn't cause it. It might have just it's come up to the kind of fore, but
right.
also that it's much more violent. It's very much more extreme. And so whether people reach out to Jane Doe program member programs, whether they reach out to you, we just want to again emphasize like people there's now programs that have hotlines and chat
Yeah,
lines and all these different ways. We don't want people to feel alone or be alone, and we got to figure
right.
out collectively. I think I'm also driven, kind of really inspired by the whole community needs assessment piece of it and how it ties to, excuse me, some of the conversations we're having about civic engagement. That civic engagement isn't just about changing a law, but it's also about, or electing people, but it's also about how do we engage our community in a civic
Mhm,
way, like civics in a broader perspective. And so some of these changes are going to happen through legislation, and some things people can do right now. Like when I
yeah,
think about like the building codes that you're trying to get passed around public accommodations, or even the gender marker X, like places can do these things now, right? Like they don't have to wait for a law to pass to tell them that they must do it. So
yeah.
I'd love to see a challenge out there that people are going to start contacting you to say, right, why are we waiting? What do
Exactly.
we
I mean,
need
the
to do?
RMV didn't wait, right? They didn't wait for this law to be passed because, I mean, this was in the works for quite some time. They didn't wait at all. They just went ahead and they're like, this is something that we can do. We're going to go ahead and do it. Absolutely. So the RMV is a really good, actually a good example of
Mm-hmm.
not waiting for a law to change your policies or change your practices. So don't wait.
Don't wait. That'll be our hashtag for this. Don't wait.
Don't wait.
Don't wait. Well, this ties to, if I can, I'm going to move to our next one, which is about
Yes.
how, survivors experience multiple levels of trauma and violence exposure, multiple levels, intersecting levels. Some of this ties to what you're talking about in terms of the, what you learned, from the community needs
Mhm.
assessment, but also some of the work we have to do around racial violence and police systemic violence and
Absolutely.
investing in community. So yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, well, this ties in really well because I wouldn't say celebrated, but we just had Trans Day of Remembrance. We just had
Mhm.
Trans Awareness Week. We're currently in Trans Awareness Month, in addition to Indigenous Heritage Month, right? That's where we are in now. Um, I mean, if you think about the sort of intersections of identity and the ways in which people experience different levels of, you said, trauma and violence, that it is, not only about gender identity, it's about, people's race and ethnicity. It's about disability, right? Sometimes it's about where you have access and what you have access to.
Resources.
And so there are so many, there are again the multiple layers in which people have experienced violence. I mean, I'm just thinking of, sometimes I think of my own experience as a brown person in this country, the racism that I have experienced, my own experience of being a child witness to domestic violence, and then in my adult years, my own experience of domestic violence, and throughout my lifetime, my own experience of sexual rape and sexual assault, and how that those levels of trauma are so impactful to just your own sort of like, can be your own self-worth, just your own, just navigating the world, having, meaningful relationships with other people.
Mhm.
And that sometimes, it's, people might think, oh my gosh, that's an angry brown person, or an angry trans person, when there's not, you don't know what people are coming with. You don't know the experiences of trauma and and violence that people have faced. I mean, this year, again, every year, every year that I see, it's like it's been the deadliest year, right? There was someone who was a trans woman who was killed on Trans Day of
I
Remembrance,
read that. Oh,
right? And so this has been the deadliest year worldwide. There's been like 350, oh, at this point, 352 people. But just in the U.S. alone, it's about, well, I know it's been about 50 people who have
identified. Yeah.
been, whether it's by violence from other folks, and I also include self-harm in
Mm.
that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's been about 53 people who have died in the United States, and that's a large number that we know of,
Right. They
as
identified.
that they've identified, because a lot of places and a lot of people are misgendered. They don't
Mm-hmm.
they don't accurately report on people's gender, or they misgender them. And there are some things where there's just not any information uh, because you know places, people don't want to give information, right? Like the law enforcement, or they don't want to give information, and
Mm-hmm.
so this is that we know of.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And it's not that the gender mark X is going to solve that problem, but I think it is part of a connected story about how people identify themselves and being able to honor that. And
Mm,
um, if we and when we don't, we miss, like, there's comes this universal story, and we
mhm.
miss the specific story here that's really important to tell about what Trans Day of Remembrance is all about, starting with Rita Hester, if I remember correctly in my historical knowledge here, of like bringing this story, this issue to light and saying,
Yeah,
no, we have to tell these stories. These are very
absolutely.
specific, targeted. And I'm just humbled by the thought of your including the self-harm, because it comes from that same place of
Yes.
self-hatred that's imposed because of what
Yeah.
society's imposing. And oh, chilling.
And I think, not only like self-hatred is also like the hopelessness and the
Hopelessness.
helplessness that
Yes.
people feel, right? And that, yeah, I think Rita Hester is one of the well-known ones, well, within in Boston, well-known,
Right.
um, and whose vigil actually inspired Trans Day of Remembrance,
Yes,
right?
I knew there was a connection there. I couldn't remember the details.
Yeah, it didn't necessarily start with Rita, but I think that the vigil that was held then inspired the vigil the next year, and that then became the
Mm.
Trans Day of Remembrance. And that not a lot of people know about Chanel Pickett, who was
Mm.
killed in 1995 here in Boston. She had a twin sister, and she was on her way to doing things professionally and in terms of her education, and her killer was caught but then set free. And so there was a lot of uh, anger and disappointment and hurt in the community. While with Rita Hester, no one, her killer is still out there. Like that is right now an unsolved mystery. So there is, yeah, there is that level of, seeing people for who they are and as people, right? Because the just recently, the Department of Justice came out with a scathing report on the Massachusetts Department of Corrections,
Right here in
right?
Massachusetts.
Right
Yep.
here in Massachusetts, and that they were minimally violating constitutional standards for ensuring the mental health safety of folks who are currently incarcerated. Last year, a trans man who was on a mental health or suicide watch committed suicide. Months after that, a gay man, similar situation, on mental health watch, committed suicide. And their approach to mental health watch is to put someone in isolation. And we know what happens to people in isolation, right? Like that is not what people need, is community. They need connection, not to be removed or isolated or to make to feel othered.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Massachusetts Department of Corrections has a lot of work to do, like a lot of work to do to just see people as human beings, because to me that's a crime against humanity.
Oh, absolutely. I think this whole public conversation we're having around police and prison reform is so important on a broad scale. And that here again, you're talking about, if we center those who are most marginalized and are therefore most at risk within that system, we'll be able to identify changes that need to happen that can actually help everyone. You know,
Mhm.
I mean, right now, every single day there's an article in the paper or in the news or a new podcast about the mental health issues that people are experiencing because of the isolation of COVID.
Yes.
How do we then not like have this light bulb that says, right, and yet we're putting people in isolation in
Yep.
prison and expecting them to get better or be
Yep.
okay, and like who's really safe for doing that, and
Right.
who does it make it easier for? It certainly doesn't help the person who's in need.
No.
um no.
Yeah.
Oh my God, community, such a systemic issue we have to address. Trans, we have covered so much here: gender-based violence, suicidality, prison reforms, gender marker S, the history of Transgender Day of Remembrance. It's um, it's it's wonderful. I appreciate it. We're coming to our close here for the segment, so we're sneaking in. I'm calling it final words. Some people
Yes.
might call it number six, but Oh, but one thing that we talked about yesterday was this idea of hope, and I wanted to leave people with that sense
Hmm.
because when you talked about that, that really stood with me, and stayed with me too.
Yeah.
So, where do you see the hope? Where are we going?
I mean, I see hope everywhere, really. I mean, you've listed out here organizing, community representation, and leadership. And to me, one of the things that what gives me hope, and I experienced this during the Boston Trans Day of Remembrance, when I saw so many young people, what they were bringing to the table, right? And that made me think about how a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests were organized by high schoolers and queer high schoolers, right? So the young people these days, they're so aware, they're so passionate, they are ready to lead. Um, so young people, they give me hope, absolutely. The connection to community, when I see so many folks in community, like the work that the Transgender Emergency Fund is doing, helping to uplift and support folks who are low income, trans people who are low income. When I see the work that Black and Pink Massachusetts and Black and Pink Boston is doing, really around abolition and really fighting for more community connections, and support for folks who are incarcerated and folks who are being released. Um, when I see the representation now that we've got more people, more queer people, more brown people, more trans people, non-binary people, more indigenous people who are being elected, right? I see that there is movement there. And then leadership, when I'm inspired by the leadership of others. And one person that I really want to highlight here is the leadership of Angelica Ross. Some people may know her as Candy from Pose, but she's also the creator of Trans Tech. And people like Angelica Ross, who, after moderating the LGBTQ town hall, um, had a conversation with Senator Kamala Harris, then Senator, now Vice President elect Kamala Harris, had a real discussion with her about the impact of her record on trans people, putting trans women in men's prisons, right? About sex workers, and about the policies that she put in place that actually helped to incarcerate more brown and Black people. And what happened out of that? There was movement, there was a shift within her, right? She actually acknowledged her role in the impact that she had and these policies had on our communities. And to me, seeing now then their uh, Biden and Harris's promise to actually address the violence that trans people and trans women of color face nationally. Now that gives me hope that there is actually a movement where there is now a real discussion and real talk. And I only hope that to see the work that comes out of that. I mean, I'm not, can't promise anything. I'm not going to promise anything, but that gives me hope. And that stemmed from the work of Angelica Ross.
But that also stemmed from the work of you, of MTPC for all of these years, who, when people weren't talking about it, when people didn't have resources or places to go, when there wasn't a sense of, an opportunity to really come together, y'all fill that place. So thank you. I am very hopeful based on this. I love this. I'm trying to get to the next slide here. I just have to get my cursor to the right place. Okay, here we go. And, people have heard all this, they're inspired. So they're going to want to know, how do they get more information? How do they get involved? Maybe make a donation, be part of your transformative work. Tell us about where people can find you.
Absolutely. You can find us on our social media platforms, on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You just go to @MassTPC. You can find us there. You can find us on the web with our new website, because our previous website looks like it was from 1991.
It looks beautiful, by the way. Nice.
I'm so excited about this new website, and it has accessibility features, so it's more user friendly. But the website is masstpc.org, and you can also email us at info@masstpc.org. So if you have any questions, concerns, comments, you can reach us there. And please note, I'm currently just a one person show, so it might take me a little bit longer to get to you, but I will get back to you.
Terrific. Well, you know what I was just about to say, not only thank you for being here, but if people heard all of this and think, wow, this must be a really big, well-resourced organization, we don't want to dispel that myth totally. You're awesome. But we want to disabuse them of that notion a little bit, that it is you yourself, and you are doing such an amazing job, but with a board of directors and volunteers, some consultants, some advisors, people who want to get involved, please reach out, help make all this work possible. Tre'Andre, thank you. Thank you so much. Before we end and close out today, I just want to remind people that if you or somebody needs help, needs support, there are resources. You're not alone. You can call these programs 24/7 every day. There are trained advocates who can talk to you about, what's going on, what resources might be available to you. If you go to janedoe.org/find help, there's a search directory where you put in your city or town or your zip code. and we'll pull up the local sexual assault and domestic violence program in Massachusetts near you. There's also a bunch of other resources there for hospital-based programs, and the our Deaf Survivor Center is one of our newest members. So there's a lot of information just so you can go and learn more about these issues. You can also call the National Sexual Assault Telephone Hotline, which will connect you to a rape crisis center. It's a toll-free number at 800-656-4673. Or in Massachusetts, SafeLink, which is the statewide domestic violence hotline operated by Casa Mirna, they can either talk to you or connect you to a domestic or sexual violence program in Massachusetts. And their number is 877-785-2020. Many of these programs, as I mentioned, are adding new features like chat and text. So if be calling on the phone either isn't your thing or isn't safe for you to do because you're, in a situation where the person who's causing you harm might be able to hear your your phone calls, please know that these other channels are also available. Mostly, we want you to know you're not alone. We are stronger together. That's where we get our strengths. We're delighted to be in community, not only with Tre'Andre and Mass TPC, but with all of you. So thank you for being here. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.